Formula One's Hungarian Grand Prix did not end with the checkered flag. It ended with penalties. Lewis Hamilton was hit with 5 seconds for exceeding the pit lane limit by just 1/10 of a kilometer per hour. Carlos Sainz received 5 seconds after contact with Oscar Piastri, reduced from the usual 10 because the blue warning lights on his steering wheel had failed. And before the race even started, Hamilton and Kimi Antonelli had already lost 3 grid positions each. Then Hamilton said the words that exposed the mood inside the paddock. Handing out penalties like crazy. Now, claims of drivers lashing out are spreading fast. But there is one crucial detail. No collective driver revolt has been officially confirmed. What is confirmed is a Grand Prix overwhelmed by sanctions, Hamilton's 4th penalty across 3 consecutive race weekends, and a growing question the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile cannot ignore. Are these rules protecting Formula One? Or are microscopic mistakes now being punished so severely that the penalties are becoming bigger than the racing itself? Subscribe to the channel. To understand why Hungary became such a serious problem for Formula One, you have to look beyond the penalties themselves. The real issue was the pattern. One decision changed a starting position. Another changed a finishing position. Another reduced a standard punishment because of a technical failure. And with every new ruling, the weekend felt less controlled by the drivers, and more controlled by documents arriving from the stewards. That perception matters. Formula One needs rules. Without them, there is no fair competition. Drivers would push beyond safety limits. Teams would exploit every uncertain area. And the final result would become impossible to trust. But rules only protect the sport when the punishment feels connected to the offense. Hungary placed that connection under enormous pressure. Hamilton's case became the clearest example. The pit lane speed limit was 80 km per hour. Hamilton was recorded at 80.1, 1/10 above the limit. That was enough for a 5-second penalty. And those 5 seconds did not disappear quietly into the result. They changed his finishing position. Hamilton had already spent the weekend fighting against another sanction. After qualifying, he received a 3-place grid penalty. That moved him backward before the race even started. Then, during the Grand Prix, he recovered. He crossed the line in 4th. The 5-second pit lane penalty moved him down again. That is why his radio reaction carried so much more weight than one ordinary complaint. Handing out penalties like crazy. He was not only reacting to 1/10 of a kilometer per hour. He was reacting to the accumulation. Another decision. Another result changed. Another moment where the race he had driven no longer matched the position beside his name. And this was Hamilton's 4th penalty across 3 consecutive race weekends. That number does not prove unfair treatment. The source does not establish that the officials targeted him. It does not show that the previous penalties came from identical situations. Each incident must still be judged on its own facts. But emotionally, drivers do not experience penalties as isolated legal cases. They experience the pattern. One weekend becomes difficult. Then another. A qualifying result disappears. A race result changes. And eventually, the driver begins expecting the next punishment before it arrives. That is where Formula One may face its first major problem. Not rebellion. Trust. A driver needs to trust that the result will reflect what happened on the track. He also needs to trust that the rules will be applied consistently. But when microscopic breaches create major sporting consequences, those two forms of trust can begin pulling in opposite directions. The rule may be clear. The outcome may still feel unreasonable. And once that feeling spreads, every future penalty becomes harder to accept. But Hamilton was not the only driver affected. Carlos Sainz received a 5-second penalty for causing a collision with Oscar Piastri. Normally, the standard punishment would have been 10 seconds. But officials reduced it because the blue warning lights on Sainz's steering wheel had failed. That detail changes the discussion completely. The technical failure did not remove responsibility. The collision still happened. The penalty still arrived. But the officials considered context. They recognized that Sainz had not received all the information normally available to him. And because of that, the punishment was reduced. That may sound like a small procedural adjustment. It is not. It proves that Formula One's penalty system is not always completely automatic. Context can matter. Technical circumstances can matter. The information available to the driver can matter. And that immediately raises a difficult question about Hamilton. If context mattered in Sainz's case, why did the tiny size of Hamilton's excess not reduce his punishment? The two incidents were completely different. One involved contact between cars. The other involved pit lane speed. The regulations were different. The safety concerns were different. So the decisions cannot be compared as though they were identical. But the public does not always separate cases through the structure of the rulebook. People see consequences. 5 seconds for Sainz. 5 seconds for Hamilton. One involved a collision. The other involved an excess of 1/10 of a kilometer per hour. And suddenly, the punishment system begins looking difficult to explain. That is where Formula One's second major problem appears. Consistency can look inconsistent when different regulations produce similar penalties. The officials may have followed every rule correctly, but the audience sees two incidents with very different levels of visible danger, producing the same time sanction. That can feel strange. And when a result feels strange, people begin questioning more than the individual decision. They begin questioning the system. Was 5 seconds too much for Hamilton? Was 5 seconds too little for Sainz? Was the reduction correct because of the failed warning lights? Should technical failures reduce a driver's responsibility? Or should the result of the incident matter more than the information available beforehand? There is no simple answer. And Hungary forced all of those questions into the same weekend. Then came the grid penalties. Hamilton lost 3 positions. Kimi Antonelli also lost 3. Their races were changed before the lights went out. And a grid drop creates consequences that extend far beyond the starting order. A driver moved backward faces more traffic, more disturbed air, greater tire stress, more risk through the opening corners, and less control over strategy. The official penalty may say 3 places. The real cost can continue for the entire Grand Prix. Think of starting a long journey 3 cars farther back in a traffic queue. The distance looks small, but every delay ahead reaches you later. Every blocked lane becomes harder to escape, and every opportunity disappears before you arrive. That is what a grid penalty can do. It changes the race before the driver has the chance to influence it. So by Sunday afternoon, Hungary had already created a powerful atmosphere. Hamilton's grid position had changed. Antonelli's grid position had changed. Sainz had received a collision penalty. Hamilton had received another sanction during the race. And the final classification no longer reflected only what viewers had watched on the track. That is why the phrase, handing out penalties like crazy, resonated so strongly. The weekend felt crowded with punishment. But here is the truth that must remain clear. There is no confirmed collective driver uprising. The source does not describe several drivers joining together. It does not report a group statement. It does not identify a coordinated challenge to the governing body. The only confirmed driver criticism of the penalties themselves came from Hamilton. And even his comment was relatively restrained. Frustrated, yes. A declaration of war, no. Anthony Davidson also questioned Hamilton's punishment publicly. But Davidson was speaking as a commentator, not as another driver joining a revolt. So the atmosphere of dissatisfaction is real. The united driver front is not confirmed. That distinction matters because Formula One already has a serious enough problem without exaggerating it. The sport does not need an organized rebellion before the penalty system deserves examination. One clear example can be enough. Hamilton crossed the pit lane limit by 1/10. 5 seconds changed his result. That is easy for anyone to understand. No complex aerodynamic regulation. No technical drawing. No hidden measurement buried inside a report. 80.1 in an 80 zone. A tiny breach. A major consequence. That simplicity makes the case powerful. And it creates Formula One's third major problem. Public perception. The governing body must enforce the rules. But it also needs viewers to believe the final classification makes sporting sense. When a driver loses a position through a visible overtake, the audience understands. When a driver loses a position after a collision, the audience can study the incident. When a driver loses a position because of 1/10 of a kilometer per hour, the punishment can feel disconnected from the race. The measurement may be correct. The emotion remains difficult. And Formula One cannot ignore emotion completely. This is a sport built around passion, rivalries, pressure, risk. The audience needs to feel that the competition remains human. But absolute technical limits are not human. They are numbers. They do not care whether the driver gained a meaningful advantage. They do not care whether the excess was visible. They do not care whether the final result feels harsh. The number is either legal or illegal. That certainty protects consistency. It can also create frustration. And this is exactly where Anthony Davidson's reaction becomes important. He questioned the logic of punishing Hamilton so heavily when the excess was only 1/10. That did not invalidate the ruling. It did not prove the timing system was wrong. It placed the scale of the offense at the center of the debate. Should a driver who exceeds the limit by 1/10 receive the same basic punishment as a driver who goes much faster? Should the system use graduated penalties? A smaller excess, a smaller sanction. A larger excess, a larger sanction. At first, that sounds fair. Then the problems begin. Where should the first level start? How much should be tolerated? Would teams immediately target the highest speed inside the lowest penalty category? Would drivers begin treating the tolerance as the real limit? Because that is what Formula 1 teams do. They find the edge. If 1/10 is allowed, 1/10 becomes performance. If 2/10 receive only a warning, teams aim for 2/10. The tolerance stops being protection. It becomes another target. And once that happens, officials must create another boundary. Then someone crosses that new line by the smallest amount. The same controversy returns. That is why strict enforcement has such appeal. It is clear. 80 means 80. No discussion. No negotiation. No opportunity for different stewarding panels to interpret the same excess differently. But strictness has a cost. It produces cases like Hamilton's. Cases where the rule appears perfect, but the outcome feels excessive. So Formula 1 is trapped. Introduce flexibility, and consistency becomes weaker. Maintain absolute limits, and proportionality becomes harder. There is no solution without risk. And Hungary exposed that more clearly than almost any technical debate could. But the consequences do not end with criticism. Teams will change how they operate. They may lower their practical pit lane targets. Instead of aiming directly at 80 km per hour, they may choose a safer number. 79.9. 79.8. Perhaps lower. That reduces the danger of another penalty. It also costs time. And in Formula 1, even the smallest loss can affect track position. A fraction lost in the pit lane may place the driver behind another car. That car creates dirty air. The dirty air overheats the tires. The driver must attack harder to recover. The strategy changes. One cautious setting can influence an entire race. That is the hidden effect of Hamilton's penalty. The governing body does not need to change the rule for the grid to change its behavior. Fear can do that. Every engineer saw what happened. Every driver understands the consequence. 1/10 saved almost nothing. The penalty cost 5 seconds. The risk is far larger than the reward. So teams move away from the edge. That may improve compliance. It may also reduce competition. And this is where Formula 1's fourth major problem appears. A rule designed to create safety can begin affecting racing performance far beyond the dangerous area it was meant to control. That does not mean the rule is wrong. Pittsburgh lane safety must remain a priority. But officials must understand how the punishment changes behavior. A driver who becomes too cautious may lose time. A team that leaves too much margin may lose positions. And when everyone operates below the official limit, the practical rule becomes different from the written one. The sign says 80. The teams race at something lower. That may be the safest response. It also shows how much power one controversial case can have. And there is another risk. The more penalties dominate the conversation, the less attention remains for the racing itself. Hamilton's performance becomes a penalty story. Sainz's incident becomes a stewarding story. Antonelli's grid position becomes a regulatory story. Every discussion begins with the officials. That is dangerous for Formula 1. The governing body should protect the competition. It should not become the central character after every Grand Prix. But Hungary pushed it into that role. Several penalties. Several changed outcomes. One highly memorable radio message. And a growing debate over whether the scale of the punishments matched the scale of the offenses. That is why the weekend felt chaotic even without a confirmed driver rebellion. The instability came from the results themselves. Fans could not simply watch the finish and move on. They had to wait, understand the sanctions, recalculate positions, and decide whether what they had seen still matched the official outcome. When that happens too often, the checkered flag loses authority. The race appears finished. The story remains open. That may be the biggest problem of all. Formula 1 needs the audience to believe the finish matters. Post-race checks and penalties will always exist. They are necessary. But if viewers begin expecting every result to change, certainty disappears. And when certainty disappears, frustration grows. Drivers feel it. Teams feel it. Fans feel it. Hamilton's message captured that feeling perfectly.